We often talk about human memory like it's a piece of hardware. We assume data goes in, gets perfectly written, and waits to be retrieved. But the biological reality is far more volatile. We don't store the past merely to preserve it. We reconstruct it to act in the present. To function at all, any memory system must execute three basic operations: encoding raw data, storing that data, and retrieving it when needed. For early cognitive psychologists, studying these operations presented a physical problem. You cannot put a thought under a microscope. The architecture of memory is entirely invisible. To map this unseen system, researchers had to deduce its existence from the outside. They subjected human participants to highly specific tasks, carefully measuring where and how recall failed. By analyzing those precise patterns of forgetting, scientists could reverse engineer the physical bottlenecks of the mind. To understand how we remember, we must look at the experimental data that forced science to abandon the idea of a passive mental filing cabinet and discover the active cognitive workspace. In 1885, Hermann Ebbinghaus began a grueling series of self-experiments. He memorized lists of nonsense syllables, tracking his exact error rates to mathematically map the rate of human forgetting. This forgetting curve shows a steep, near vertical drop on the left. The most severe data loss happens immediately. Following the curve to 31 days, it levels off. This mathematical plateau proves long-term retention depends heavily on immediate rehearsal. To explain this, the 1968 multi-store model was proposed. Information enters sensory memory on the left, holding raw data for a fraction of a second. With attention, it moves to the central box, short-term memory, which is strictly limited to about 7 chunks. Without active rehearsal, those chunks vanish rapidly. In a 1959 experiment, Peterson and Peterson gave subjects data to remember, but immediately forced them to count backwards to block rehearsal. Within just 18 seconds, the data evaporated from short-term memory. This early model treats the mind as a rigid, sequential assembly line. Under this framework, active repetition is the only mechanism preventing total data decay. A critical architectural question remained: how do you mathematically prove that short-term and long-term memory are two physically distinct systems rather than a single continuum? The answer came from the free recall task. Participants study a long list of words and then write down as many as they can remember, in any order. Plotting this task yields Murdoch's serial position curve. The blue column shows the primacy effect. Early words are rehearsed into long-term memory. The red column shows the recency effect. Late words remain actively circulating in the short-term buffer. To test this separation, researchers Glanzer and Kunitz introduced a definitive stress test. They had participants memorize the list, but before letting them recall the words, they forced them to perform a grueling math distractor task for 30 seconds. The distractor task completely wiped out the recency effect, flatlining the right side of the curve, but the primacy effect on the left remained entirely intact. By destroying one memory type while the other survived, scientists had their proof. Short-term and long-term memory operate on entirely independent mechanisms, but the sequential multi-store model had a logical flaw. Clinical patients with specific brain damage possessed nearly zero short-term memory capacity, yet they could easily form new long-term memories. If all data must pass through the short-term waiting room first, that shouldn't be possible. Abandoning the waiting room concept, Badley and Hitch proposed the working memory model. At the top, the central executive dynamically routes attention. It coordinates independent subsystems, the phonological loop for audio and the visuospatial sketchpad for manipulating visual imagery. If memory is a bustling workspace, a new problem arises. What actually determines which data survives the jump into long-term memory? Craik and Lockhart's levels of processing framework argues memory durability depends on how deeply you encode data. Shallow processing analyzes superficial traits. The highest retention occurs at the bottom tier, deep semantic processing, where the brain analyzes the actual meaning. To create a high-fidelity memory, you cannot rely on robotic repetition. You have to actively engage with the material through semantic elaboration inside the working memory system. Once data is stored, it must be retrieved. This taxonomy tree shows the architecture of long-term memory. Notice the primary split. On the left is declarative memory, containing conscious facts and episodes. On the right is non-declarative memory, covering subconscious motor skills. Accessing this archive relies on the principle of encoding specificity. A stored memory is only accessible if the environmental and internal cues present during retrieval match the cues that were present during encoding. In 1975, Godin and Baddeley demonstrated this with scuba divers. Divers who studied lists of words underwater recalled those words far effectively when tested underwater compared to being tested on land. Retrieval is the act of pulling these scattered, cue-dependent fragments out of the archive and reassembling them inside working memory's episodic buffer. This real-time reassembly exposes a vulnerability. Cognitive psychologist Elizabeth Loftus proved how fragile this process is through her experiments on eyewitness testimony. Subjects watched a video of a car crash and were asked to estimate the speed of the vehicles. Loftus found that the estimates drastically increased if the researchers simply swapped the word hit for the much more violent word smashed. A week later, subjects exposed to the violent verb were significantly more likely to falsely remember seeing broken glass at the scene, glass that was never in the original footage. The memory itself had been permanently overwritten. This is the misinformation effect. It demonstrates that remembering is an active reconstruction, one easily corrupted by new data introduced during the retrieval phase. The patterns of forgetting and reconstruction mapped by these experiments reveal a system prioritized for utility over archival accuracy. By treating our experiences as flexible fragments rather than fixed records, the human mind can reassemble the past into a map for the future.